We've told you many stories about coal mine explosions caused by coal dust or methane that gets ignited. Those events are terrible, and they take a great toll on the coal miners and on their families. Today, though, we tell of another type of explosion in an Appalachian chemical plant far from any coal mine. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, A History of Appalachia.
Steve, I think what interests me about this story is I didn't know about it until my father was hospitalized at, of all places, Wholesome Valley Hospital down in Kingsport. And I found out about this just by reading the wall that they had dedicated to this event that took place in Kingsport. And we'll just go ahead and tell you that's where it took place at. But I had no idea all the intricate things that went along with this, of how they had to get rescue people in and so forth, because this was something that had just never happened before.
It was a terrible event, and it lingers in the memory of anybody that lives in Kingsport, anywhere near Eastman Chemical Company, which is where this happened. It was a major event that made national and international news at the time. And the time that did happen was on October 4th, 1960, which started out as a day pretty much like any other. A bright and sunny early fall day in the mountains, filled with school and work and life, just like any other day. But for the people of Appalachia, this was a day not to be forgotten, because this was the day that the Eastman exploded. Now, Tennessee Eastman Chemical Corporation was at that time a subsidiary of Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. The main plant was located in Kingsport, Tennessee, partly on the Long Island of the Holston. And Eastman makes many of the products that you and I and Rod use every day, probably the best known of which is that plastic Coke or Pepsi bottle that you might be holding in your hand right now as you listen to this podcast. Among the many other chemicals produced in Kingsport at that time was something called aniline, a precursor to things like polyurethane and certain dyes. It can also be combined with other chemicals to make rocket fuel.
Whew, that's lethal stuff, too, if it's not handled in the right way. Well, the aniline plant itself was set up in 1957, and it started having problems right from the start. The first time the plant was started up, there were leaks everywhere, causing a shutdown. It turns out that the chemical had corroded the steel valves, of all things, causing plant workers to have to fabricate new parts out of titanium and replace the steel ones. Due to the volatility of the process, the aniline plant was only run at night when the number of workers was, at a minimum at the plant, for safety reasons. The first time that the plant was operated during the day was on October 4th, 1960.
Operations started at 11 o'clock that morning. The plant ran until that afternoon, when it was shut down at 3 o'clock for safety checks. Nothing out of the ordinary was found at that time, so they started operations again around 4:15, and that is when things started to go wrong. It's not known for sure, but some sources say that aniline plant manager Yusuf Haney and another man noticed some anomalies in remote readings from the plant and went to the building to investigate about 4:45. That's when all hell broke loose. The plant itself exploded like a huge bomb, destroying about a city block's worth of Eastman Chemical buildings. The blast shattered windows within a 3-mile radius of the operation and caused damage to several businesses in downtown Kingsport, especially along Market Street. Now, this being the height of the Cold War, many residents of the city initially thought that they were being bombed and dove under desks or took to fallout shelters like they were trained to do when they were kids. Others, aware that there were hydrogen gas storage tanks on Eastman property, assumed that there was a hydrogen bomb about to go off. Mind you, an explosion of those tanks would have leveled a large part of that side of the city, but there would have been a whole lot less damage if it had actually been a hydrogen bomb explosion, which, by the way, was impossible. Men were desperately trying to get away from the area, scrambling up and over chain-link fencing around the perimeter of Eastman property. Why don't you tell them about that, Rod?
Well, Steve, since the explosion happened at the shift change time, men were in the company showers getting ready to go home. Several of those men scrambled out of the wreckage of those shower houses stark naked and ran for their lives. Many of them were picked up by passing motorists and driven to the hospital. One man, a Tennessee Eastman repairman, was found walking along the side of the road several miles away, completely unaware of how he had gotten there. There were accounts of severed limbs and bodies strewn throughout the plant. Well, ambulances arrived from throughout East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia to help the injured, who were transported to then Holston Valley Hospital for treatment of lacerations, broken bones, and yes, chemical exposure. Well, the blast sent shrapnel flying in all directions. There was a car along Lincoln Street that saw a piece of debris smash through the windshield and out the back window without hurting the occupant of the car. It turns out that the driver was, at that very moment, installing fog lights on the car and was bent down, passing the wiring under the passenger seat when the object, a foot-long piece of pipe, sailed right over his head. Several people caught out in the open were killed by the flying debris.
Wow. A witness on Skyline Drive, which is on a hill overlooking Kingsport, just happened to be looking at the Eastman plant at the time of the explosion. This witness reported seeing the aniline building just slowly raise up and then fly apart right before the blast hit. According to other witnesses, a pickup truck was pinned to the ground by an H-beam near the bridge to Long Island. A 300-gallon tank wound up under that same bridge. Overhead pipelines running next to the building had broken and were spewing flames like a blowtorch. The fuel for that was from that hydrogen in the previously mentioned hydrogen tank, so there was a real danger of an explosion of those tanks. Firefighters from around the area worked throughout the night to make sure that that didn't happen, and the fires were eventually extinguished. The final count of the dead from this tragedy is 15, with over 200 injured. And here's a list of those who perished.
Bernard C. Arnold, employed at Eastman for 17 years, worked in the acid division. J.D. Byington, 50, with Eastman for 23 years in the S&M division. Dr. A.J. Chadwell, 29, worked in the acid division as a research chemist. J. Carl Cochran, 53, with Eastman for 26 years and worked in the acid division. R. Carl Cox, 59, employed at Eastman for 20 years in the acid division. Cornelius Y. Depew, 36, employed for 11 years in the organic chemicals department. Yusuf Haney, 45, worked for Eastman for 20 years. Haney was a chemist that was in charge of the aniline plant in the organic chemical division. J.D. Mullins, 39, employed by Eastman for 20 years in the acid division. Manzi Powers, 50, with Eastman for 17 years in the shops and maintenance division. Ed O. Repass, 51, worked in the stores and warehousing division. James W. Ott Sage, Jr., 28, employed for 7 years in the acid division. Jimmy W. Sanders, 27, office services department. Jess Ray Shell, 35, organic chemicals division. John W. Squibb, 44, organic chemicals division for 18 years. And Arthur H. Stevens, 44, resident of Sullivan County for 30 years.
Overall damages were estimated to be in the neighborhood of $5 million. According to a Kingsport Times news report of the time, the detonation was caused by a mixture of nitrobenzene, nitric acid, and water. The plant itself was never rebuilt. Now, there are still signs of the explosion today, with pieces of shrapnel embedded in walls, broken windows, and, most curiously, a large metal ring embedded in the asphalt of a road inside Eastman that was ground smooth and by now paved over with fresh paving. To this day, the people of Kingsport remain on guard for a repeat of this incident. And Rod, we had one of those incidents just a couple of years ago at, as you know, my law office, and at that time, the studio for the podcast and for the YouTube channel was located in a building on Market Street. And that morning was an odd morning. There was a whole parade of police cars and fire engines that drove by, heading toward Eastman down Market Street with no sirens, no noise, no nothing. And it turned out that they had that last big incident out there. So I guess with what happened in 1960, they were being very careful not to get people panicked in Kingsport if anything happened.
Well, I mean, this has always been something that has scared the people of Kingsport for a long time, not knowing when something like this is going to happen. But like I said to start the podcast, I didn't know this had happened. I had always driven by there on the bridge. I guess that's North Eastman Road, coming by there from, close to where the plant is. And I always wondered about the building over there. And I'm like, why did they just leave a building standing there with windows broken out? And why was the situation just look like it was in turmoil with the rest of the plant looking like, brand spanking new? And then when my dad got hospitalized, I found out. Then we sat down and we recorded an original podcast audio version of this, and it explains why that building still stands there today. And that is because of what happened, to serve as a reminder to everyone that, this sort of thing can happen, and they try to prevent it from happening, but sometimes things have just a different way of, presenting themselves.
That's true. And folks, that's another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Now, if you'd like to be kept up to date on the stories that we give you here on our YouTube channel, please be sure to go down below, click that subscribe button, ding the bell so you get notifications, and if you don't mind, give us a thumbs up too, okay? Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.